Hi, good morning, everyone. We welcome you to this interview titled Agrarian Crisis and the Future of Farming in India with Professor B.B. Mohanty, who is currently teaching as a professor in the Department of Sociology, Pondicherry University. His recent books include Agrarian Change and Mobilization, SAGE, Critical Perspectives in Agrarian Transition, India in the Global Debate, Rutledge, and Agrarian Transformation in Western India, Economic Gains and Social Cost, Rutledge. Currently, he's also the managing editor of Sociological Bulletin. We welcome you, sir, to this interview. Thank you for taking time out for us and doing this interview.
Thank you. Thank you for your kind words. Thank you so much.
So to begin with, let me ask you that, you have done some very interesting works on farmer suicides in India, particularly in the state of Maharashtra. So because farmer suicides is again something that gets the limelight for, some months or some weeks every year, how would you understand these instances from a sociological perspective and sort of break the idea that these are only economic, cases in nature?
Thank you for your interesting questions. I will first prefer to answer the second part of your question, that whether these instances of suicides can be seen only as from economic point of view. These instances of farmer suicides cannot be viewed as a kind of pure economic phenomenon. They are primarily primarily sociological in nature. And we need sociological perspectives to understand it in a most scientific manner. When these suicides, actually, the wave of suicides were reported in the mid-90s, the few economists, they were the first to study this problem. And they came forward with the argument that the farmers are committing suicide due to rising cost of cultivation, growing indebtedness, and the decline of farm income. And they did not look into the differences among the farmers. They considered the suicide victims as a kind of homogeneous category. So I actually question their analysis and their idea of economic rationality. And I actually, if you see my writings, I have major quarrels with economists. I question their economic rationality, which is based on logic but not on facts. And I follow Durkheimian line of argument that economics, in order to be scientific, has to be a branch of sociology. So point is that the economists, they cannot provide a kind of adequate explanation to this understanding of the suicides. So they need sociological dimensions, and they have to draw the sociological inputs. And these instances of suicides are purely sociological in nature, and it can be understood only through a kind of sociological lens. So my point is that it cannot be viewed from the economic lens. And coming to the second part of the question, which needs elaborate kind of answer, to my analysis, the causes and conditions of suicides were many, and they are the result of the complex interaction between historical and contemporary conditions and forces. The suicide victims do not constitute a kind of homogeneous category of farmers. This is what actually my point. And the suicides of the large and medium farmers, who are largely drawn from the higher caste, their suicides were occasioned by their failures in business, trade, and politics. On the other hand, the suicides of the small farmers, who were largely from the lower and middle caste, it was caused by a kind of actually it's a kind of their division. That actually it happened when they found themselves, when these small farmers they found themselves trapped between their enhanced aspirations and the reality of neoliberalism. The reality of neoliberalism. And my point is that these instances of suicides are consistent in the line of the argument made by Durkheim that suicide as an effect of individualization, a process of socio-economic estrangement from agrarian communities experienced by the farmers in the context of rapid economic transformation. Additionally, actually, I explain how caste relations or caste is a kind of source of their disappointment and isolation and individualization. I have explained that how these small farmers, they, since they belong to the lower caste, they aspired actually for something very high given their background of their deprivation, and in reality, their aspirations are ill-conceived and they could not realize their aspirations. Therefore, they had a kind of despair and disappointment. I try to reinterpret the theory of suicide of Durkheim in the light of his earlier work on division of labor. And I found actually there are two sets of reasons, two broad types of causes of farmer suicide. One is the disproportion, one is actually the disappointment which resulted from the disproportion between achievements and aspirations, which generate a kind of sense of loss of social regulation, which led to the generation of kind of anomic conditions. And the second one is the isolation that emanated from weak ties with family, neighborhood, and community, following individualism of agriculture and decline of traditional social order, which can be referred as loss of social integration, or which led to the creation of egoistic conditions. So my line of argument is that egoism is a prerequisite for the emergence of anomic conditions, because the lower level of achievements or decline of the farm income was common or general for all categories of farmers. And the disproportion between achievement and aspirations were felt by those farmers, those who had a kind of weak ties with their family, kinship, and neighborhood, because the moral regulations and normative demands which are placed on them decrease because of their weak ties with the community, neighborhood, and family. They kept their aspiration at a very high level. So therefore, when in reality they understood that it is not possible to make those achievements, so their disappointment increase. So point actually I am trying to make that the individuated and isolated farmers, they were because they were having weak ties with their family and neighborhood, therefore they were unable to have a kind of impact of the social regulation placed on them by the communities or neighborhood or family. Therefore, their aspirations went off, and the disproportion between achievement and aspirations and achievement became more. Therefore, it led to a kind of anomic conditions. Point is that unless there is egoistic conditions, anomy will not emerge. So my point is that the egoism is a kind of structural characteristics of the modern agrarian economy and society, and anomy is the kind of consequent effect. So to my argument is that there is only one type of suicide. Durkheim's egoism and anomy can be only one type, and where actually the egoism is actually the key force, key impulse. Because of that, the anomy conditions emerge. Then next thing is that I also asked another kind of important question, that why do these farmers, those who have experienced, or those who had a kind of a background of rebellious spirit during the second part of the 19th century, and those who participated in organized movements in the early 70s and 80s in the aftermath of the Green Revolution, now they are resorted to killing themselves in the post-reform period. So, based on my empirical exercise in Maharashtra, I try to make a comparison between these three types of conditions, because Maharashtra had a kind of long background of peasant movements. It had experienced Deccan riot, and it was also having this Satyakari Sangathan movement in 1980s, and also the peasant suicides in 1990s in post-reform period. So I tried to find out why these farmers, they had a kind of varied responses to different types of to the same kind of agrarian crisis at different periods. So I wanted to see that, and to explain this, I relate my analysis with the famous debate led by James Scott and Samuel Popkin, Scott-Popkin debate on moral and political economy. That is the moral or rational economy, or you can say political economy debate. And you know, James Scott, he argued that peasants, they rebel when their ethics of subsistence and ethics of reciprocity are violated. When the ethics of subsistence and ethics of reciprocity are violated. And peasants opt for safety first principle, and they are risk averse, and they do not make cost benefit calculation. Their prime concern is subsistence. So they rebel only when their basic minimum subsistence is threatened or questioned. On the other hand, Samuel Popkin, who is the advocate, proponent of this political economy approach, he said that peasants make risky investment, and they make cost benefit calculations, and their behavior is always guided by economic rationality. Their behavior is always guided by economic rationality. They join protest movements if they find that it is beneficial to them. So I tried to see these contrary views in the context of Maharashtra, and what I found that we need to go beyond this debate, and the stereotypical binary between profit and subsistence, moral and rational, risk and safety, they are actually not serving our purpose. We must go beyond these binaries. And what I found, the peasants, true, they go for safety first principle, but also they make risky investments. They also adapt changes. During colonial period, during the time of American Civil War, they went for cotton cultivation. They made some risky investments. And during post-planning period, post-Green Revolution period, they also adopted Green Revolution technology, adopted high-yielding varieties of technologies. And they also make profits. They also intend to make profits to maximize their subsistence. To maximize their subsistence, they also make profits. And similarly, they also make some cost-benefit calculations. Though profit is not their primary aim, their primary concern is that to see that how much is left with them, who is taking how much, that is not their primary concern. So point actually, so they have both the kind of elements. The profit, they want to make profit, they want to follow the safety first principle, they also don't resist to change, they adopt change. So then point is that actually, why do these farmers argument actually made by Samuel Papin that farmers are guided by their economic rationality. My point is that farmers are rational, whether they rebel, whether they join protest movements or they commit suicides. Rationality in our case is a variable. It cannot be taken as an assumption. During colonial period, they joined protest, they rebelled against the moneylenders because when they found that state is not intervening, moneylenders are not behaving in a lenient manner or they are not giving any remission, and with their extra labor, they are unable to secure their subsistence. And side by side, they were also mobilized or educated by a kind of organization that is called Pune Sarvajanik Sabha. So put together this thing and also the kind of cohesiveness which was there in the rural society that motivated them to rebel against the moneylenders and the landlords. During post-colonial period or an aftermath of Green Revolution, they joined protest movements because their earlier experience told them that when they are joining protest movements, they are getting some benefits from the state, from their experience during the Maharashtra drought. When they protested, state is providing better relief measures. And another thing was that there was a kind of autonomous political organization, Satkari Sangathan movement, with an appropriate kind of ideology. And also, they had a kind of cohesiveness because there was among the peasants, there is a common quest for self-respect and identity in the context of the growing rural-urban divide. So all these things put together, they found it rational to join the protest movements to secure their subsistence or to meet their rising kind of aspirations. But after the post-reform period, they committed suicide because the state, the enemy was not clear to them whether who is the enemy. Earlier enemy was state or moneylender, but here the enemy was not clear. Market was deciding everything. And second thing is that the rural society was divided because of the individualization of agriculture, rivalry and competition among the farmers, and also there is the farmers movements, the organization, the Satkari Sangathan, that organization, that actually, that ideology appeared as kind of ambiguous to them. And the farmers, they found it difficult to support this movement because Saroj Joshi, the leader of the organization, in the post-reform period, he openly sided with corporate interest and the rich farmers. So therefore, farmers were confused and they did not support this movement. And none of the political parties also they came forward and they came to the rescue. And the community is not supporting them, so they felt helpless and committed suicide. So point actually I want to argue that peasant behavior is always rational, whether they join protest movements or they rebel or they committed suicide. So rationality is a kind of variable in sociology, unlike in economics, where it is treated as a kind of an assumption. So this is what actually I tried to explain, and my focus was basically on both historical and contemporary courses, and I tried to develop a kind of sociological lens based on the work of Durkheim and the discourse that followed him, and also on peasant rebellions, the debate, the Scott-Papkin debate, and also the discourse that followed that debate. So I hope I answered your question.
Yes, sir. Thank you for that answer. Our next question to you is that, do you see agrarian transformation taking place in India? How do you see this process of agrarian transformation in India? And would you also say that regional disparities are at work here? keeping in mind that you've done your research in Maharashtra and Odisha?
Yeah, as you know, this agrarian transformation started with British colonialism to enhance land revenue. And during post-colonial period, we transformed agriculture through two types of measures. One through institutional reforms like land reforms, community development program, and cooperatives, and also through technological reforms like adoption of high-yielding varieties of seeds and associated infrastructural development. And the current phase of transformation means the neoliberal phase of transformation. It is induced by market integration and neoliberal globalism. And this has actually put agriculture in a high growth mode and profit mode, and which has altered significantly the scale and relations of production to a kind of far greater extent, which was not experienced earlier. And this kind of transformation has brought a kind of turbulence in terms of income, employment, livelihood, labor relations, mobilities, and distribution of and access to productive resources. And the effects of this transformation, as you know, it was not uniform. And I must tell you that though there is the objectives of these three periods, the transformation during these three periods were common: to enhance agricultural production or to maximize agricultural productivity. But the attempts which were made during colonial period was to commercialize agriculture with least investment. And during post-colonial period, we tried to modernize agriculture by adoption of new technology and also keeping in mind the objective of social justice. But during neoliberal period, we tried to focus more on market integration and try to expand production on a kind of global scale without paying much attention to the idea of social justice. And during colonial and the post-colonial transformation, here the focus was, or the intention was guided by the state-led measures, whereas during neoliberal period, the reform measures were guided by market fundamentalism. And as you know, the effects of this transformation, as I told you earlier, that it was not uniformly felt during colonial period, during post-colonial period, and also in the current phase. Developed regions in Maharashtra, if you take the example of Maharashtra, like the developed regions like Western Maharashtra, they remain much ahead of other regions in terms of major developmental indicators. The advanced regions, as I told you, the Western Maharashtra, changed its agriculture in tune with the demands of neoliberal policies. The greater linkage between industry and agriculture was created. The farmers shifted to fruit cultivation, sericulture, aquaculture. All these new kind of methods of farming were developed in the demand matching with the demands of the neoliberal policies and programs. Whereas the backward regions like Vidarbha, Marathwada, they struggle to catch up with the changing situation. And my analysis actually was not purely economic. As I told you that I have always differences with economists. And I looked at the politics of regional development, and where I tried to establish the fact that this rapid agricultural modernization in the developed regions of Western Maharashtra was facilitated by unified political class that dominated the state politics through caste and kinship networks. The backward regions of Vidarbha or Marathwada, they are unable to compete due to the absence of a well-articulated structure of fractions and alliances. The Western Maharashtra actually, they grow more actually the sugarcane, and there is a strong sugar lobby, you must be knowing. And they have more area under irrigation in terms of mechanical appliances, consumption of electricity for agricultural purposes is far higher than the other regions. And all the heavy political weights are from Western Maharashtra, and they have a kind of strong kinship caste network with other regions. There are also chief ministers of Maharashtra from backward regions, but instead of serving their own regions, they serve the interest of the Western Maharashtra to keep their actually alliance with their caste and kinship groups. So that happened in case of Maharashtra. Therefore, the regional disparity continued, and it is continuing. It is now getting perpetuated in course of time. Same could be said about states like Odisha, even Uttar Pradesh also. Odisha also same thing happened. The coastal Odisha is advanced, and the tribal pockets are backward. And here also similar. If you look at the politics, this also society and politics is completely dominated by the upper caste, Korons and Khandais. They dominate the society and politics, and because of their dominance, one part where they are actually concentrated, where they are actually having more vested interests, that part develops in a kind of faster manner than the backward regions. So this is what actually I feel the regional disparity is always at work, and this is because of not only because of this economic factors, it is also because of social factors, because of the influence of caste and kinship. This kind of politics of regional development is going on.
Right. So our next question to you is on again that we see that the rural Indian economy is still agrarian centered. Land remains the most important asset in our society. So how does land ownership pattern across different castes, genders, and tribes in India? How is it placed now, and what kind of impact does it have on the future of farming in India?
No, this is a very good question. It's true that land continues to be the most valued asset till now, and around which socio-economic privileges and deprivations in rural India revolves. And land ownership in rural India is skewed, and the members of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, they are the most disadvantaged section in terms of land ownership, despite the fact that they are the people those who work mostly on land and derive their livelihood from agriculture. If you go by the data furnished by the Agricultural Census of India, recent data released, it is opposed to the year 2015 and 16, only 9% of the area, total area, is operated by the scheduled caste, and in case of scheduled tribes, it is 11%. And this happened actually after so many years of implementation of land reform measures. Now we do not talk about land reform measures more seriously. And that is, I gave the all India figure, but there are states which are further actually lower than this level of achievement. And I must tell you that states which have experienced organized movements by the members of the scheduled caste or by the scheduled tribes, there only some improvement have taken place in that land holding position. It's not only, it cannot be attributed only to the land reform measures. In states like Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Kerala, the scheduled caste landholding position is relatively better compared to other states because of their organized protest and active kind of vigilance. And similarly also in case of tribals, scheduled tribes, parts of Maharashtra, Telangana, Jharkhand, they have experienced some kind of better progress compared to their counterparts in other states, primarily because these pockets they experience movements by the tribals. So point actually I want to tell you that now in the 90s, after the neoliberal reforms, there is a kind of paradigm shift, and because of neoliberal policies, they do not give prominent role to the market and give minimal role to the state, and that actually the land reforms now is more market oriented, and neoliberal policies restricted the scope of land reforms in distributive justice and equality. And at the same time also, there is weakening of movements by these socially disadvantaged groups because their focus is shifted more to the reservation issues than these land related issues and other kind of core issues that is perpetuating inequality in the rural areas. And among the socially disadvantaged groups, women are the deprived most section in terms of ownership and access to land. And if you go by the current statistics as furnished by Agriculture Census of India 2015-16, only 12% of the operated area is being controlled by women, constituting about half of the population. And this figure actually is further low in states like Odisha, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, and states like Maharashtra. Those who have experienced movements by women, and where actually there are some campaign for the land rights of women, like Lakshmi Mukti program in Maharashtra. So because of that, they have experienced some positive improvement in favor of women. So point actually I wanted to argue that there is a positive correlation between organized movements and the improvement of the landholding position of the socially disadvantaged groups, scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and women. So in order to improve the landholding position, land reform measures, however well framed, won't work unless there is a vigilant kind of a public opinion and organized movements by these deprived section to monitor the progress of land reform measures. So then, regarding the future of farming, I can tell you that in the neoliberal period, as I narrated earlier, the rapid change that took place following the neoliberal reforms since in 1990s, in the process of placing agriculture on a high growth mode, brought significant structural changes in the rural economy and society. The new conditions of production made agriculture economically unrewarding due to decline in profitability and unprecedented in the rise in the cost of cultivation, and also growing risk and uncertainty in the sphere of production and marketing. And ultimately, this generated a sense of disappointment and distress among the farming communities. As you know, there are instances of suicides because of these changes. And moreover, agriculture lost its traditional importance as a source of social status, prestige, and honor in rural areas, while city or urban-based economic activities acquired social significance. Farming now in rural India, what I found in case of Odisha recently, I have done a piece of work which is under consideration. So what I found that farming is considered as an inferior kind of occupation meant for the uneducated and non-achievers. And the rural youth aspirations in rural India are built away from agriculture and village. Nobody wants to do agriculture and stay in village. In response to these changes in the front of economic sphere as well as social sphere, the members of higher and cultivating caste shifted to other occupations like trade, business, politics, and took up jobs in towns and cities. And the scheduled caste, the members of scheduled caste and scheduled tribes, and to some extent the service rendering caste, whose exit option is blocked because of the lack of education, required skill, they emerge as a kind of farmers, as lease-in farmers. They are taking land on lease from these upper caste, and they are emerging as a kind of lease-in farmers. And if you see the lease-in holding, number of lease-in holdings across the states in India is increasing. And states like Odisha and West Bengal, near about 30%, 1/3 of the farmers are the lease-in holders, and they are largely from these groups. And the upper caste youths, rural youths, they do not want to do farming. There are many studies in UP, in Punjab, and they are also having the similar kind of things that the youths are gradually withdrawing. But my point is that though there is a growing trend of agriculture, there is a concentration of aged population in agriculture because of the withdrawal of the youths. But unlike the West, unlike the developed countries of the West, that it is not unlikely to pose a challenge for farming in India, because the youths of the scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, and service rendering caste, they are increasingly participating in agriculture, and moreover so the women are also from these communities. They are increasingly participating in agriculture. And because of another reason, you please take a note of it, that the state policies nowadays, the populist policies which are being launched in response to the demands of electoral politics, like distribution of food grains at a subsidized price and direct cash transfer, union government and state government policies. This is providing a kind of sense of security to these deprived sections to remain in village and do agriculture, because they have no other option. They are not well educated, they do not have resources, and they do not have also the kind of required social capital to move to the urban areas or take up kind of urban or city-based occupations. So having no other option, they confine them, they remain blocked actually in the villages. And this kind of reform, this kind of populist measures provides a kind of a sense of security to them to do agriculture. So point actually I want to emphasize is that the future of farming in India will be in the hands of the scheduled caste, tribes, and women for some more years in the future. And the argument is that with the development of global capitalism, the peasantry will disappear in India, which has happened in the developed countries of the West. That is unlikely to happen in the case of India because of its unique social composition. Because the members of the scheduled caste and tribes, women, and also the service rendering caste, they have no other choice. They want to make a living or earn their livelihood through agriculture. Therefore, the lease-in practice is increasing among them. And the government policies and programs which are in place is, in a sense, discouraging them to look beyond kind of agriculture. So it is actually, they find it is convenient to them. They have done agriculture as a kind of agricultural laborer for years together. They were working as agricultural laborers. They have seen agriculture at a closer proximity, and they know how to cultivate land. And they found that it is convenient rather than going to a kind of a alien sector where they do not have any kind of resources and do not have a kind of support, social support to carry out their economic activities. So therefore, is the debate which is going on about the existence or persistence of peasantry in India is, to my knowledge, actually, it is, if you see, this will not actually be the same as it happened in case of the developed countries of the West, where the agrarian transition took place in a very smooth manner. Here, the small peasantry will continue to exist, and large section of this small peasantry will be drawn from the socially deprived groups. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. We have come to the end of this interview, and we'd like to thank you from the Doing Sociology team for taking time out and talking to us today. In this interview, you've talked about your work and you've raised some of the very important questions around agriculture and Indian economy and society. And these questions have become very important, more so now, given whatever we're seeing in the news today in the country. And I'm sure our viewers, our young viewers would go back and read your work after having watched this interview as well and take a lot from it. Thank you once again, sir.
Thank you so much. Thank you.